Welcome to the Forward Miami Show. I'm your host, Damian Pardo, and Forward Miami is a local nonprofit that works specifically on diversity and inclusion issues. I'm thrilled today to have as my guest Commissioner Bruce Kaplan, attorney Bruce Kaplan, friend Bruce Kaplan. Welcome to the show.
Damian, thank you.
Listen, one of the things I always thought about, and I remember it being very interesting, was how you ended up in Miami, I guess via New York. So I thought you could take us back and kind of talk a little bit about that.
Well, Miami, I guess, was a destination of destiny. And after coming to Miami on business during the very early 80s, during law school, after law school, I got a job offer, a wonderful job offer via the Caribbean, and came to Miami to work on a full-time basis in 87.
Wow.
And fell in love with the lifestyle, with my neighbors. Living on Miami Beach at that time was a privilege, and still is, but it was very different. And there was a new young vibe that was just beginning to happen, the Art Deco movement.
Right.
So it was
historic preservation, that whole, which we're kind of losing, which is sad. I mean, I live in Morningside, and we're seeing those mammoth buildings going up and traffic patterns changing, and a lot of those really great buildings kind of, going away.
It's a shame. Bigger isn't necessarily better. I understand the economics, but sometimes you have to sacrifice quality of life for economics for quality of life, because this really is a wonderful place to live. And if we're going to allow transients or transplants who are welcome, always, the more, the better. But please adapt to our lifestyle and don't force us to adapt to the very vertical Manhattan or Los Angeles or Northeastern lifestyle.
And it's funny because in some ways it's like the same transplants want to create the same thing here, that didn't work for them over there. So it's kind of strange, when you think about certain levels of development. But I remember back then during that time period, always being awestruck by you because you spoke Spanish perfectly, fluently, Jewish faith, and you were Republican at the time. And just like you were so Miami in so many ways, because, one of the things we were talking about earlier was political polarization and how sometimes, you have these two different ways of viewing everything from extremes in politics. And I didn't know what you thought about that at that time, especially, particularly as a Republican.
Well, I loved Miami. I loved the vibe. New York, while it claims to be a tremendous melting pot, is really a mosaic. It's more a salad bowl where everybody maintains a neighborhood and identity. And very often you don't cross neighborhood lines. And what I loved about Miami was we were at the very cusp of the inclusion of everybody from all walks of life. Yes, a lot of transplants because there are very few native Miamians, but the real draw, the real attraction was that you can be a part of the salad bowl, but it tended more to heat up a little bit and get that little mixture going. So being a Jewish Republican wasn't antithetical to being a Miamian, and being a Miamian wasn't antithetical to speaking Spanish.
But you represented an area that had South Beach, which was gayer at that time, right? True. It was, and then you represented Little Havana. So you had this area, which at the time, we had met because I was working on the Human Rights Ordinance issue. And a lot of people don't know, but for history's sake, you are the person that introduced the Human Rights Ordinance, which ultimately gave LGBTQ people protections and benefits that did not exist for them in this county. So
one of my proudest moments in government.
And it should be, because it took a tremendous amount of courage. I lived it. So I know what you did. People don't know what you did. And even though, when you introduced it on the first go round, it failed by really one vote. I would tell you,
vote we had counted on.
A vote we had counted on. I know. now I'm going way back.
Yeah.
A vote we had counted on. But even though when we introduced it, and it was interesting because a lot of the gay community wasn't supporting it. They were afraid because it was still the Anita Bryant layer of ice when it happened in the 70s. And I remember people talking about, but I don't want to get fired. I don't want to get beat up. I don't want to get spit on.
True.
I don't want to, right? They were still living that trauma of the late 70s, 76, 77, 78.
Sure.
And so they didn't want it to come up. So you not only had to battle regular public opinion, but you also had to battle all these other things.
Yeah. Damien, coming from New York, I worked as a law clerk for Roy Cohn, who was at the forefront, Studio 54 and Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager, very much at the forefront of first of all, combating AIDS, realizing that AIDS was a problem, combating it. But on the other hand, New York was very homogenous at that juncture. New York was 20 years into, we don't care what you do as long as you produce.
Right.
You can be creative, you can be gay, you can LGBTQ plus. Didn't exist as a term. It was exist or move
or matter, right? In that way.
And so coming here and seeing that there still was a stratification and a real disdain, if you will, and self-loathing amongst some of the more traditional leaders, because there was a dearth of leadership truly in the community. I came to really respect and love you. Because you have the scars. You've got the scars on your back. You and a very limited group of very brave people were willing to form an alliance with a guy you didn't know. You guys, all you knew was Republican, Miami Beach, establishment. I was chairman of the Downtown Development Authority. I was chairman emeritus of the Public Health Trust. I was establishment. Well, no. I was raised in a very different ambiance, and that was inclusion. And so
that's what I mean, that you were kind of like the perfect right person at the right time, because you could speak to all these audiences that the traditional Democrats at the time, and a lot of people don't realize it, but that's why a lot of times I'm against that kind of polarization, because actually that party, which for LGBT at the time, and like you said, that didn't even exist, the gay community at the time, gays and lesbians, fell by default into that party. So that party was kind of like, well, there's no place for you to go. So,
and they used you.
Right, you got to do what we say. In a way, it was very monolithic,
cynical.
In its approach.
You were used.
But yet, at the same time,
you were used.
You could speak to these communities that they couldn't even access. So you went on Spanish radio, you went on a bunch of different, shows as an advocate for basic human rights. And I mean, I won't forget that, because it's one thing to have somebody that's doing a political strategy. It's another one to see somebody who's invested in it and has made it a badge of honor and is going to do the work. And you were that person. And I think it's like when you're part of history and you lived it, and then you see how it gets revised in some ways.
Sure.
Rarely, are you included in that, in the historical context.
Defeat is an orphan, and victory has 1,000 fathers. I'm cool being one of the unwritten footnotes, perhaps, but it was really not so much a badge of honor. It was just the right thing to do, and it made sense only because when somebody, a constituent, said, "Look, I've got a problem. And the problem is I'm not being treated equally. And I feel less than somebody else." Well, quite frankly, that pissed me off. It was less a political calculation, much more, I'm here to do something good. For $500 a month, which is what you still today are paid on the county commission.
Wow.
It certainly wasn't for the money, although PACs and Citizens United has changed that equation. A lot of people are living off of political contributions, but in those days we couldn't, and we didn't. So you might as well, and I figured I had to at least do something right. And what I learned was, if I could go to, for example, the Lubavitch conservative Orthodox community, and if they wouldn't support it openly, at least I got them to stand down. Just look the other way, because everybody has somebody within the LGBTQ community in their family.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
one of the lessons for the younger generations, at least for me, that I try to impart when I'm speaking with them is don't affiliate yourself with any one extreme. Focus on the work. Stay true to the work, and
True.
you will start building inroads to everyone.
Without a
And
doubt.
and like you just said, if you can walk into a room and speak to the Lubavitch conservative, movement
Yep.
or group, and you can walk into a room and speak to only Spanish speaking Republicans with a certain mindset on communism or freedom and democracy, you have access that lots of people don't have. So from just a human strategy, you want to try to always keep those doors open and build alliances with as many people as you can, because how would we know that we had something in common?
Sure.
Even though, at the time I'm a Democrat, gay, activist, or whatever term they used to use, at the moment, but that's how I would have been, now today I might be considered a corporatist, or I don't even know what I'm considered
You
anymore.
consider Damien, which is the same way I considered you, and that was the optic that I brought from the Northeast. But on the other hand, I had also spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, and I dated a flight attendant, and I would say 3/4 of her colleagues were gay, and we had some of the nicest, warmest, closest relationships that you can imagine. And harkening back to New York, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
A person is a person, and unfortunately, politically, you have to kind of jury rig the ways around things. Like it makes no sense that a marriage certificate would dictate the nature of one's relationship when it's the relationship that dictates the nature of one's relationship.
Right.
And you can have a really lousy gay relationship, or you can have a really lousy straight relationship, but you can have a really great relationship, and that partner needs to be honored and taken care of and provided for if it's a legitimate, genuine relationship, period.
Yeah.
And if you look at it that way, it really then became and becomes and should be very, very easy to do the right thing. I couldn't understand why anybody would oppose this.
Well, but I mean, they were different times, 1997, 1998. We got lucky that we had a mayor, Alex Pinellas, who agreed not to veto or to leave, or, which that was a huge victory at the time.
Sure.
I think he was the only Democratic mayor until now, we may have, and unfortunately it did fall in somewhat of that party line, because at the time Republicans as a party were completely opposed to anything that was LGBTQ. So, I think we got lucky to have had Alex in place, to have had Katie Sorensen and Jimmy Morales come on board, and all of these other developments that eventually led us, and George Marsuli, who did an amazing job. That final charge, in 1998, and everyone that coordinated that whole thing was huge.
It wasn't easy. I have to chuckle, and you and I have had this conversation over the years, but bringing all of these heroes, these modern day heroes on board wasn't easy. Now they may be seen as the deans or the beacons of liberal thought, but the truth of the matter is they're probably more cowardly than someone from the very extreme right that just said no, and on a very principled basis said no, and that you respect much more than somebody who looked at the polling or weighed the politics of their district to try and then jump on board, and then when it succeeded, take credit for it. That's okay. It got done. And, I learned that from my work in the intelligence community. I learned that in the hills of Kurdistan, dealing with tribal leaders and trying to convince them that we weren't going to kidnap their children. We were actually going to offer them jobs in a rebuilt Iraq, that we had their best intentions at heart, was very much the same as trying to convince a right-wing Republican that this wasn't the end of the world, that Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't going to all of a sudden be implanted on Miami-Dade County the very next day. And you know what? It isn't. It
No,
hasn't.
and it never
it didn't.
exactly, and none of that ever, it just came down to rhetoric, which
Yeah,
unfortunately a lot of things fall prey to.
sure.
I know one of the things we wanted to talk about, we talked a little bit earlier, was how hate crimes is evolving, especially during this time of year.
Incredible.
Yeah, that's been a real uptick recently. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing and some of the challenges.
Yeah, Damien, this is the time of year. Easter is a very, very significant, probably the most significant holiday in the Christian calendar, and Passover as well tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and the time of most joy and celebration often empowers those that feel the most belittled or somehow disenfranchised, and they do stupid things. Hate crimes are born of ignorance. Very few are really fundamentally motivated or with a core ideology. It's really some form of rebellion and the ability, the means and the methods and the opportunity then sort of all come together in this perfect storm of hate. And what I've seen is that the increase of attacks and violent attacks, killings at churches, at synagogues.
Here is that, that's happening.
Not here. We're in a bubble in Miami-Dade County for now. But who would have thought that in San Diego there would have been a shooting at a synagogue, or in Philadelphia there would have been a shooting and murders at a synagogue?
I've never understood, and this is really ignorant on my part, but I've never understood the hate aimed at Jews. Honestly, I just don't. What is? There's a big disconnect for me. What is the hate?
I growing up in New York and being one of maybe 5 Jews in a prep school, for 12 years, was subject to every slur, slanderous term in the world. But didn't really take it personally because I gave back as good as I got and excelled in athletics. So I really did give back as good as I got, as you did too, as a standout in high school, Damon. You know the deal. If you hit hard enough, people
you gotta hit.
You gotta hit hard.
Leave you alone.
Leave you alone. But why Jews in particular? Maybe because people loathe the success of others, and maybe percentage-wise, Jews have succeeded, or at least are more openly philanthropic or knowingly philanthropic with regard to other
wouldn't you love
communities.
that? Aren't those all good things?
That should be.
And most of us, especially like Pardo, that's a conversion name. We have Ashkenazi,
Sure.
So most of us have a connection, to Jews or are Jewish, or so I just, and everything you've just mentioned is successful. Those are great qualities, philanthropy. Yeah. So where does the hate is envy or
envy, opportunity, the facility with which the community openly participates. Most of the leadership, and a lot of your colleagues were from the Jewish community.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And
in
men,
the
women,
history and the movement, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
And the civil rights movement in general.
100%. If you were to tell me who comprised the bulk of the people fighting for LGBTQ rights back then, by large numbers, Jews comprised a big chunk of that.
Oh, without a doubt. But the very interesting antidote to hatred and anecdotally from the intelligence, how do you find the antidote? And that's just assimilation. Well, okay, no, discard that.
Right.
Standing up for who you are, absolutely, but gaining the respect. And that's done by forging alliances, strategic alliances. It's very easy to say, oh, well, I'm going to take Mr. X, who was a wonderful career administrator at the FBI, and we're going to turn them loose and let them solve. Well, the guy's been riding a desk, or the woman's been riding a desk for the last 20 years. That's not going to produce a creative solution to what must be an out-of-the-box response to crimes that have absolutely no logic. I can't give you a reasonable or coherent answer to your question. Why the Jews? Why the gay community? Why? Who knows? People hate. So you have to deal with haters by forging unions with other groups that have been hated and are still hated. Forge a union and a community bond with groups that are currently under attack. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference just issued their annual hatred report last week. And what it shows is anti-Semitic attacks are first in the nation.
Wow, that just blows my mind. It just does. I mean, it's easier for me to understand color and racism and a lot of these other themes, you know, that drive people to do really stupid acts of violence.
Really stupid. But you know what? Forging alliances, giving, sharing, thinking out of the box. It's not putting an immovable object, you know, in front of an intransigent thought process, i.e., putting a wall in front of an idiot isn't going to work. And so if we can be creative and we can somehow break down the objections as we did so many years ago, and build and forge these really strong bonds that last and can withstand the test of time, we'll all be safer as a community.
So you're also
happier as a community.
And so you're also saying that during these times, during the religious holidays, that kind of violence spikes.
It does. But look at the message of Easter. Look at the message of Passover: endurance, rebirth,
resilience,
resilience. And it's something to be celebrated and something to be embraced.
That's why it's so counterintuitive, you know, that would be.
But it also is a time where people gather in one single place, making that community an easy target.
Of course.
You've got to kind of look, and just putting some guy with a gun in a uniform is maybe a physical deterrent, or a woman with a gun is a physical deterrent. But the truth of the matter is that the preliminary work, everything leading up to that one cataclysmic or potentially cataclysmic moment, is what counts. And so if we can work on that, and hearkening back to the next LGBTQ march, now I know it's evolved, and thank goodness it's evolved beyond we want rights to how can we use these rights to better our community and all other communities. And that's the wonderful place that we find ourselves in. And hopefully it's where we will find ourselves with regard to religious faiths and any other oppressed communities.
I mean, we saw that with the Arab community, with Muslims. We've seen that in lots of different ways. Is there anything that you think can, obviously outside of this conversation, to help or alleviate that situation
Oh, Damien, just conversations like this, having perhaps some introspection and feeling that, well, maybe that person that I don't understand, who's dressed in a way that I have never seen or can't comprehend, isn't quite as different from me or from my family or somebody that I know that I believe, or that I believe. And we all have ingrained belief systems and subsystems. But the truth of the matter is that if you look at DNA and you look at, the genome project was probably the best thing that ever happened, because what it showed is that 0.001% differentiates us all.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty revealing fact that we're all the same. And what you look like, what I look like, by the way, you look marvelous. You've aged a hell of a lot better than I have.
No, not at all.
But
no, and listen, I think a place like Miami allows us to explore this much better than homogeneous, cities that are a lot more alike.
Yeah.
Because we do. I mean, I know just recently there was an attack on South Beach for an art installation of an LGBTQ Black artist that was it was a hate crime, was considered a hate
Absolutely.
crime. And homes were also attacked of Jews specifically, and swastikas,
Sure.
placed on them. And, I feel like in a place like Miami, if that's happening here, what's happening outside of here? Because I do think we're a lot better at it, because we do all have to work with each other. We do all have to learn from each other.
Sure.
Much better than in other cities. So I can only imagine, if you're not exposed to any of these differences, the kind of fear that it might drive inside of you, because I really think those acts are driven by fear at the core.
So. There's a Jewish cemetery downtown. It was a traditional, one of the oldest cemeteries in the nation, and wasn't allowed on Miami Beach. The irony was that Jews in large part owned a lot of the hotels along the strip, yet couldn't be buried there, yet couldn't join the country club, yet couldn't participate in so many things. And in the exodus from Cuba, 1959, 1960, Operation Pedro Pan, all of the various waves leading to Mariel in 1980, and then the Balseros in the 90s, and then the newest generation that are now just kind of prancing across the border and buying everything they can in gold exchanges and going back to Cuba. Well, everybody has their own modus operandi, but the truth of the matter is that hate and the unknown drives stupid people to do really stupid things. So if you can interdict them and somehow creatively work with other communities, forge an alliance with the Baptist Bishops Association, with the LGBTQ community. Now, one of the things that you did, Damien, and what I really appreciated was that you sat me down with, won't mention a name because he's a wonderful, dear friend, a federal prosecutor at the time, who was just kind of figuring about whether or not he was going to come out. And we sat down and had a really lovely breakfast. And law enforcement doesn't get any better than being a federal prosecutor. And in Miami, at the height of the mob wars,
the drugs and all that,
the beginning of the Russian mob coming in, we didn't know how to handle it. And yet this guy was on the front line coming out. Very handsome, erudite guy who actually allowed me to get across the line, because I felt if I had the support of law enforcement, if I had the support of folks from a traditional background, whatever their personal life being, it would be easy to transcend, bridge the gap, whatever you want to call it. We can still do that today. We have to do that today, because as hate crimes increase, and the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference report does indicate, is it's growing. The Anti-Defamation League, which keeps daily, minute by minute track of it, indicates that it certainly is growing. We're blessed. And truly, Damien, you know as well as I that we have the best police in the country. This is the Harvard of policing, the Academy for Miami-Dade.
Agree.
The best. The city of Miami, although has been probably slightly more fraught, has the best as well. And all of a sudden, the applicant pool is going back to the 1 in 20 acceptance, as opposed to the almost 1-to-1. Basically putting a gun on a security guard is what they were doing for maybe 10 years ago for 5 years thereafter. And it shows, because the quality of policing declined, the incidence of crime increased, and we're now seeing, fortunately, a decline as the professionalism is really brought to the fore. And then I have to give a shout out to J.D. Patterson, who became the czar under Mayor Cava. And of course, all of the folks that have followed in his footsteps now, as even in this last year of this administration. So we're blessed at a city level, we're blessed at a county level, and in the Southeast, the federal local partnerships are very strong. Although I have to say that probably local policing, at least at the level that we're interested in, which is defeating hate crimes at the micro level, at my community level, your community level, everyone's community
level. And Catherine
level.
Fernandez-Rundle had started the whole hate crimes kind of bureau and the prosecutions, and So I think we had good leadership as far as the issue as well.
We had and her spouse, if you will, is very active in the Anti-Defamation League. But what I have to say is that it's one thing to talk the talk. The other thing is to walk the walk. Unfortunately, prosecutions haven't kept up with arrests, and intervention and interdiction hasn't kept up with prosecutions, or prosecutions haven't kept up, rather the reverse hasn't kept up with the arrests. So I think there has to be a sea change, perhaps, in really ramping up local prosecutions on cases that are brought by local law enforcement, because who knows the houses of worship, be they a house, be they a home, be they a formal house of worship, whatever the case may be, who knows it better than the local police? And that's something that we have to look at, and perhaps that's the best way forward, other than protect oneself. One's
Good
family.
point. And on the topic of hate crimes as well, the recent bill that was introduced in Florida with the family rights bill, which is also called the Don't Say Gay bill, is a good example of a place where we should be able to have this reasonable conversation as a community and stand up together against it, mainly because it's really a stigmatized kind of bill, or it stigmatizes LGBTQ people for absolutely no reason. You look at the bill, it opens up districts and teachers to lawsuits. I mean, it's something that is not really constructive or helping in the schools. It's a valid concern. If you have kids of a certain age and you want to be able to protect them from your perspective, from getting certain conversations that you don't think they're ready for, understand the concern. But what was put forward was no way a solution that really helps particularly LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ kids, parents, and communities, or anyone for that matter. I think it's a bad bill for our entire community. But we don't have a strong presence coming out of the Republican Party or local leaders saying this is bad for all of us. So I kind of view that specifically as an opportunity for Republicans to come out and say, wait a minute, we understand that this is being done in the state house, and we understand the governor's going to run for election, and this is probably a good national topic to help build the base. But at the end of the day, you have two parties feeding their base, and the people getting hurt are the people in the middle, and the people who need to step up and speak up are the people in the middle.
That's so funny you say it's time for the Republicans to come out because there is an
interesting choice of words.
Yeah, but you know what? The log cabin Republicans exist. I want to. The great example is Rick Grinnell. Rick Grinnell was the Trump-appointed U.S. ambassador to Germany, who went over there with his husband and blew Angela Merkel's mind because he was just in her face 24/7, and he ultimately became the national security advisor. Now think about that. A gay man became the national security advisor of the United States of America, arguably the leader of the intelligence community in the free world.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Impressive as hell. And Rick is a wonderful person. He's the most intelligent guy you'll ever meet, the most open and candid intelligence leader, and really the model of what needs to be in the future. And certainly a wonderful emblem, that log cabin, whatever, Republican, whatever you want to call them. But Republicans are gay too. And I'm a Democrat, of course, as you know, but what really upset me about this whole Don't Say Gay episode is that the Democrats, in typical fashion, kind of put their fingers in their ears, going, yeah, I'm not hearing you. I don't, like children. I'm not listening.
Well,
I'm not
the
listening.
bill actually doesn't say "Don't say gay."
No, it doesn't.
So it doesn't help.
But you couldn't even have the discussion,
right? You couldn't even have.
If anybody questioned, it was, "I'm not listening. I'm not listening." So I mean, one is infantile, the other was hateful, and
that's why the middle needs to do the work. The middle needs to. Seriously, I think. More and more, I mean, I wish we had a third party. I wish, our system didn't just have two, because it creates these, these situations that aren't favorable for regular folks who are probably mostly in the middle.
Very much so. And it's really easy to paint everyone with the same brush. And
human nature.
It's human nature. Yeah. It's easier to put somebody in a box and then categorize them and either accept them or discard them than it is to maybe try and open the box and see what's really inside. And when you see what's really inside, hey, you may like it. And maybe that's what people are afraid of. Who the hell knows? But the gating and overarching factor in all of this is that this was the wrong time to introduce a flawed piece of legislation that was certain to be a magnet for this. But what it really did, and strategically, if you look at it, it was brilliant because it drew attention away from all of the other potentially obnoxious things that both parties were introducing during this legislative session, and the posturing that's going on with a view to 2024 and the view of who is going to come in and perhaps be the next leader in the House, the next leader in the Senate at the Florida level, and even the new congressional districts all play into the arguments and the goodies and the pork that was hidden while we were distracted by this really ridiculous argument. Because I don't think you should legislate the bedroom. How do you legislate the bedroom? How do you legislate love? How do you legislate a relationship? You know, the LGBTQ community has divorces. I handled, as a young law clerk, one of the first gay marriage. It was constructive marriage then in New York. It was a case called Hannum versus Tebelak. And it was the author of Jesus Christ Superstar. And his partner sued him. And it was a fascinating journey through what marriage really is, because it had nothing to do with sexual preference. It had everything to do with infidelity and money. And you know what? It's the same theme that is universal in any family court setting where there's a divorce or a custody battle or what have you. So, you know, legislation doesn't solve that. Legislation doesn't identify you with a flag. You know, we're a virtuous state. Why?
And
because
legislation doesn't change the way people feel.
No.
So, but listen, we could go on for hours. I think this is a good place to end on. Like,
absolutely.
Look at the whole person, consider the whole person.
Yes.
And as we head into next week and onward, it's a good way to leave our audience. So for everyone out there, please join us again next week. And thank you for watching.